The Force had no name for what tore open above Coruscant. It wasn't a hyperspace exit. It carried no ion trail, no ship signature, no registered transponder frequency. The Imperial sensor arrays blanketed across Coruscant's upper atmosphere, the most sophisticated detection network in the known galaxy, registered only a single cascading impossibility, awound in space itself, roughly 40 meters across, pulsing with energy that no Imperial scientist could classify. In the 3 seconds it existed before slamming shut like a closing eye. What fell through it were 2 figures. No ship, no pod, no life support apparatus of any kind. Just 2 beings, descending through the cloud layer of the Eternal City at terminal velocity, trailing light behind them like dying comets. The Imperial traffic control towers above Sector 7 flagged the anomaly in the same breath that TIE Fighter Squadron Auric 9 was scrambled to intercept. Lieutenant Voss, monitoring from the Coruscant Orbital Defense Station, watched his screens with the particular expression of a man whose career was evaporating in real time. The objects, he couldn't call them pilots, couldn't call them debris, were slowing down. Not from drag, not from parachute deployment or repulsor activation. They were slowing down because they chose to. Goku hit the cloud layer first and felt the galaxy push back against him. It wasn't pain exactly. It was more like pressure, a vast, invisible ocean pressing against his Ki from every direction. Curious and ancient and utterly alien. He had felt different worlds before. He had stood on planets with crushing gravity, breathed atmospheres that would kill a normal human, trained in conditions that would shatter mountains. But this was different. This galaxy had something woven through it, something alive and boundless, and it pressed against his Ki like a second atmosphere he hadn't anticipated. He stabilized his descent anyway, instinct overriding confusion, golden energy flickering at his fists as he broke through the lower cloud shelf and got his first look at Coruscant. He almost forgot to breathe. Every direction, every horizon, building, light, steel, movement, a city without end stretching in all directions, climbing vertically into the sky above him and descending into shadowed chasms below. Layer upon layer of civilization stacked so dense it had consumed an entire planet. Speeders wove between towers in ethereal streams of traffic. Lights blinked on structures so tall their peaks vanished into the upper atmosphere. The scale of it hit him the way a full power punch rarely did. Somewhere deep behind his sternum. Wordless and enormous. Where? He started, then stopped, because there was no answer to reach for. He turned, instinctively, toward the other presence he'd felt the moment the rift had taken them both. Superman had already steadied himself 40 meters to Goku's left, cape snapping in Coruscant's artificial upper winds, blue eyes sweeping the cityscape with the systematic focus of a man who had learned long ago to assess impossible situations before reacting to them. He could see for kilometers in every direction. He could hear the city's heartbeat, billions of voices, thousands of languages, the mechanical roar of an infrastructure so vast it had its own weather patterns. He could also hear the fighters coming. "We have incoming," he said, his voice carrying easily across the distance between them. The dimensional rift had deposited them close enough that communication wasn't a problem. Understanding each other was, apparently, not a problem either. Something about the crossing had granted them basic linguistic comprehension, a detail neither would fully examine until much later. 8 aircraft. Fast, aggressive formation. Goku turned his head toward the sound he couldn't yet hear and felt the Ki signatures. Instead, small, mechanical, no living pilots inside them, and his expression shifted into something between curiosity and readiness. Are they friendly? Superman looked at the angular black fighters screaming toward them through the lower traffic lanes, cannons already rotating to active position. I'm going to say no. The TIE fighters opened fire. Superman took the first volley across his chest without flinching, the green energy bolts scattering off his Kryptonian physiology in showers of dissipating light. He felt them, more than he would have in direct sunlight. The filtered solar radiation of Coruscant, meaning his invulnerability, was operating at reduced efficiency. But they did not come close to penetrating. He was moving before the second volley fired, not toward the fighters, but laterally, drawing their attention away from the traffic lanes below where civilian speeders were already scattering. In panic spirals, Goku flickered. One moment he was stationary, hands in his pockets with the casual posture he defaulted to when he wasn't sure a situation required full commitment. The next he was beside the lead TIE fighter, matching its speed effortlessly, peering through the cockpit viewport at the pilot inside, a young Imperial officer whose face had gone the color of bleached durasteel. Goku held up one hand, open palm, the universal gesture that required no translation. The pilot, to his credit, recognized it. He pulled back on the throttle. The squadron, operating on Imperial reflex and discipline, did not. The remaining 7 fighters converged. Superman caught 2 by the wing struts, arresting their momentum with the controlled application of strength he'd spent a lifetime learning to modulate, setting them down on a nearby platform with enough care that neither pilot was harmed. Goku let a burst of Ki wash outward, not an attack, a shield, and they concussive wave redirected 3 more fighters, off course without destroying them, sending them spinning into controlled drifts that their pilots could correct for. The last 2 broke formation and screamed toward the upper atmosphere, emergency signals broadcasting on all Imperial frequencies. The message was already sent. Somewhere above them, on a star destroyer holding low orbit over Coruscant's night side, a communication officer straightened in his chair and began composing the most unusual report of his career. And somewhere deeper, in the palatial darkness of the Imperial Palace at Coruscant's crown, behind doors that no senator had ever opened and no officer had ever been invited through, a figure seated on a throne of engineered, shadow-opened eyes the color of corrupted amber. The Force had just shown Darth Sidious something new. He did not smile. Smiling was for lesser beings who needed to express delight outwardly. Instead, the Emperor simply folded his hands within the folds of his robe and allowed the sensation to wash over him. 2 presences in the Force, blazing like twin novae, unlike anything the galaxy had produced in 10,000 years of recorded Sith history. Not Jedi, not Sith, not anything the dark side recognized or could categorize, which meant, Palpatine reflected, with the cold patience of a man who had spent 60 years executing plans within plans. They were either the most dangerous things in the galaxy or the most useful. He reached for his com. If you want to see more characters enter the Star Wars galaxy, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. May the Force be with you. Coruscant had a bottom. Most citizens of the upper levels lived their entire lives without acknowledging this fact that beneath the gleaming spires and senatorial districts and imperial administrative towers, beneath 100 layers of civilization stacked over millennia, there existed a world that the Empire had not so much conquered as simply forgotten. Level 1313. And the sublevels below it existed in permanent artificial twilight, lit by failing industrial lamps and the bioluminescent fungi that colonized the gaps between. Ancient duracrete. The air tasted of recycled exhaust, street-cooked protein, and something older beneath it all, the accumulated residue of a civilization, built on top of itself for so long that the foundation had begun to breathe. It was, Goku decided, genuinely fascinating. Superman was somewhat less enchanted. They had descended deliberately, following the density of civilian life downward, through the city strata, after the Imperial scramble above made the upper levels tactically untenable. Neither of them had discussed the strategy formally. It had simply been obvious to both, in the way that it is obvious to 2 people who have spent their lives making instant decisions in impossible situations, that drawing a military response away from populated areas was the correct first move. They had slipped beneath the traffic grids, descended through maintenance shafts wide enough to accommodate industrial freight, and emerged into the underworld through a corroded ventilation grate that Goku had simply pulled apart with one hand. "We need information," Superman said, his voice low, eyes cycling through the visual spectrum as he scanned the warren of structures around them. Thermal imaging showed him dozens of life signs in the immediate vicinity: humanoid, non-humanoid, several categories his visual cortex had no reference for. "We don't know where we are, what's happening politically, or who those aircraft belong to." "They shot first," Goku offered. "Yes, which tells us something, but not enough." Superman's jaw set in the particular way it did when he was suppressing the urge to simply fly to the highest point available and start asking questions loudly. "We need someone willing to talk to us." As if in answer to this, a voice spoke from the shadows to their left. "You're the ones who fell from the sky." Her name was Sarah Vindel, and she had the eyes of someone who had learned to sleep lightly a long time ago. She was human, somewhere in her mid-30s, with the kind of lean economy of movement that came from years of navigating spaces where being noticed too long meant being reported. She wore nondescript civilian clothing over what was clearly a tactical underlayer, and the blaster on her hip had seen enough use that the grip was worn smooth. 3 others stood behind her in the mouth of the alleyway: a Chilek male with a prosthetic left arm, an older human man whose bearing suggested military background despite the civilian clothes, and a Mirialan woman who hadn't taken her hand off her own weapon since they'd appeared. A rebel cell. Small, experienced, frightened, in the way that people are frightened when something disrupts a plan they've spent months constructing. "Word travels fast down here," Superman said carefully. He kept his hands visible. It was a habit so deeply ingrained he performed it without conscious thought. "Everything travels fast down here. It's the only advantage we have." Sarah studied them both with the focused assessment of someone running rapid calculations. Her gaze lingered on Superman's suit, the cape, the symbol on his chest, and then moved to Goku's orange GI with an expression that suggested she was revising several assumptions simultaneously. "You took down 8 TIE fighters without weapons, without a ship. You're not Imperial agents, because Imperial agents don't embarrass Imperial pilots and then disappear into the underworld. So what are you?" "Travelers," Goku said, "from a long way away." "How far?" He considered this with genuine thoughtfulness. "Very." Sarah looked at Superman, who gave her the most honest answer he could construct under the circumstances. "We arrived through some kind of dimensional anomaly above your city. We don't fully understand it ourselves. We are not here to cause problems for anyone who isn't trying to cause problems for us." He paused. "We intercepted some energy readings before we descended. There's something large in orbit, multiple large somethings. Military vessels." "Star destroyers," the older man behind Sarah said, before she could stop him. His voice carried the clipped precision of someone trained in military briefings. 3 of them holding low orbit since yesterday morning. That's not standard Coruscant garrison rotation. Sarah shot him a look. He didn't apologize. Why would they change the rotation? Superman asked. The rebel cell exchanged a look that carried entire conversations. In it, the compressed communication of people who had operated together long enough to have arguments silently. Sarah made a decision. "Come with us," she said. "There's something you should see." The safe house was 4 levels deeper, accessed through a drainage maintenance corridor that required knowing exactly which floor panel to lift, and in what sequence. Inside, it was surprisingly functional: a central holoprojector, bedrolls along one wall, weapons in various states of maintenance on a table, and a communications array that had been assembled from components sourced across a dozen different black market vendors. The rebel cell had been thorough. What the holoprojector showed stopped both Goku and Superman in the entrance. It was a facility, underground, deep underground, below even the sublevels, carved into the ancient bedrock beneath Coruscant's foundation, layers in caverns that the official Imperial survey maps didn't acknowledge. The footage was fragmented, clearly obtained at enormous risk, the image quality degraded by interference from whatever shielding surrounded the location. But it was enough. Soldiers, thousands of them, standing in formation in caverns large enough to swallow small towns. Not standard stormtroopers. These wore armor that was darker, heavier, with configurations that suggested modifications far beyond standard Imperial specification. Between the formations, robed figures moved. Sarah identified them in a flat voice as dark side adepts, not inquisitors. Something older and less publicly acknowledged, performing rituals over the soldiers that left faint, traces of visible dark energy, hanging in the recycled underground air. We've been calling it the Phantom Legion, Sarah said. We don't know its full size. We don't know its command structure. We know it doesn't answer to the Imperial Senate, doesn't answer to the Joint Chiefs, doesn't appear in any official Imperial military registry we've been able to access. She looked at the projection with the expression of someone who had stared at a problem long enough that fear had curdled into something colder and more functional. It answers only to Palpatine. Directly. Personally. What's it for? Superman asked, though something in his voice suggested he already understood the shape of the answer. Insurance, the older man said. If the Empire ever fractures, if the military ever stops being loyal enough, if someone decides the Emperor is a liability. He shook his head slowly. It's an army designed to hold power when everything else fails. Loyal to one man. Conditioned through the dark side to be incapable of disobedience. Goku had been quiet through most of this, standing with his arms crossed and his expression carrying the particular focused stillness he adopted when something moved him past casual interest into genuine concern. He wasn't a political creature. He didn't fully understand the mechanics of galactic empires or senatorial structures or the administrative architecture of authoritarian control, but he understood the shape of what he was being shown. An army built in secret, conditioned to serve one person, hidden beneath an entire world full of people who didn't know it existed. Those soldiers, he said. The ones in the footage. He paused. Were they volunteers? The silence that followed was its own answer. His expression didn't change dramatically. It didn't need to. Something settled in his eyes that anyone who had ever faced him across a battlefield would have recognized immediately the quiet, absolute clarity that preceded his most serious commitments. Superman saw it and felt something align in his own chest in response. Different origin, different world, different everything. But that look he recognized without needing a translation. Outside the safe house, deep in the bedrock below them, something vast and dark and patient waited in the caverns it had been built to fill. And somewhere far above, in the ambulate darkness of the Imperial Palace, the Emperor lifted his head and smiled the smile he never showed anyone. He had felt them stop moving. He knew exactly where they were. The summons came not as soldiers, but as silence. Sarah noticed at first the way the underworld's ambient noise, that constant arterial hum of machinery and distant voices and dripping condensation, that never fully stopped, simply ceased. A pocket of stillness spreading outward through. Level 1313 like a stone dropped in still water. Vendors closed shutters without being told. The handful of beings moving through the corridor outside the safe house disappeared into doorways with the practiced speed of people who had learned to read that particular silence the way farmers read weather. Something's coming, she said. Goku was already at the door. He had felt it before the silence, a pressure in the force-saturated air, dark and deliberate, moving through the underworld's layers with the patient certainty of something that had never needed to hurry. Not one signature. Many. Disciplined. And cold and stripped of the individual variants that living beings normally carried. Whatever the Sith alchemy had done to the Phantom Legion's vanguard, it had not made them more human. It had made them less. How many exits? Superman asked, his voice completely level. 3, the Chilek, Daro, said, already moving toward the communications array to begin a data wipe. 2 are compromised if they've covered the main maintenance corridors. Then we use the third. Superman looked at Goku. I'll take the rear. I'll go ahead and see what we are dealing with. Goku was already gone before Superman could respond, moving through the safehouse back passage at a speed that made Sarah's breath catch, not the mechanical speed of a ship or a speeder, but something organic and absolute, a body operating at a level that simply didn't correspond to any biological reference she possessed. The Vanguard numbered 40. Goku counted them in the 2 seconds it took him to cover the distance between the safehouse exit and the mouth of the main corridor. 40 soldiers in that dark, heavy armor, moving in a formation too disciplined for standard stormtroopers, too fluid for battle droids. They carried weapons he didn't recognize, longer than standard blasters, with emitter arrays along the barrel that pulsed with a faint crimson light, and at their head, moving with the unhurried authority of something that considered its victory a logistical matter rather than an outcome in question, walked a figure in dark robes, not Sith, not quite, taller than a standard human, with the elongated, deliberate movements of someone whose physiology had been altered. The commander carried no lightsaber. Instead, both hands were bare, and the dark energy that moved around them was visible, faint, crawling threads of corrupted force energy that the Sith adepts below had woven into flesh and bone through months of ritual conditioning. The commander stopped when it saw Goku standing in the corridor alone. A long pause. "The Emperor," it said, in a voice that resonated at a frequency slightly wrong for normal speech, extends his invitation. He could have just asked, Goku said. The 40 soldiers raised their weapons simultaneously. Goku exhaled slowly, settled his weight, and dropped into a stance so natural it looked like relaxation. "Okay," he said. "Let's see what you've got." What followed was not a battle in the conventional sense. It was more accurately described as a very thorough examination. The energy weapons the Vanguard carried fired compressed darkside infused plasma, a weapon specifically engineered to disrupt force-sensitive physiology by introducing corrupted midi-chlorian interference into the target. Against a Jedi, it would have been devastating. Against Goku, whose Ki operated on entirely different metaphysical principles, the bolts connected and spread across his body and achieved approximately the effect of rain on a mountain. He moved through the formation with the focused economy of someone who had fought opponents at every conceivable power level, not destroying, not retaliating with full force, but reading, probing, understanding what he was dealing with. The soldiers were strong, genuinely, surprisingly strong, conditioned beyond normal human limits. The dark side infusion granting them speed and endurance that would have overwhelmed a standard military unit. They adapted their formation in real time, responding to his movement with a collective intelligence that suggested the Sith alchemy had created something closer to a hive-coordinated unit than individual soldiers. But they were not in his weight class. He came to a stop in the middle of the formation, surrounded, and allowed 3 of them to strike him. Simultaneously, full force, impacts with the reinforced gauntlets of their dark armor, and remained stationary, letting them feel the futility of it, giving them the honest data of what they were attempting. The formation hesitated. The commander raised one hand, threads of dark energy building between its fingers. Superman came through the far wall. Not dramatically. He didn't lead with heat vision or a sonic boom. He simply stepped through the duracrete with the measured, unstoppable momentum of a man who had decided a wall was no longer a relevant obstacle, and put himself between the commanders, gathering dark energy and Goku's position with the automatic priority of someone whose first instinct, always, was interception. The dark energy discharge hit him across the chest and shoulders. He stumbled, genuinely stumbled, one knee dropping to the floor, the corrupted force energy finding the gaps in his reduced solar reserves and pressing through them. It wasn't pain in any conventional sense. It was more like cold, a deep, reaching cold that moved through his cells and told them, quietly and with great conviction, to stop. He pushed back, stood, slowly, with visible effort. That, he said, is new. The commander studied him with those wrongly resonant eyes. The Emperor anticipated resistance, it said. He did not anticipate this quality of resistance. The threads of dark energy rebuilt themselves, larger now, recalibrating. Behind the formation, Sarah and her cell had used the engagement to reach the third exit. Goku had bought them exactly the time they needed. He caught Superman's eye across the corridor and communicated, in the compressed shorthand, of two people who had independently spent their lives making instant tactical decisions. They needed to move, not retreat. Neither of them was built for retreat, but maneuver. The confined corridor was limiting their options and concentrating the Vanguard's collective strength. Up, Goku said simply. Superman was already moving, punching a shaft through the ceiling with one upward strike, Duracrete raining around them. They went up through 4 levels in seconds, emerging into a wider maintenance bay that gave them room and gave the Vanguard a problem. They, soldiers, were disciplined and strong, but 40 men pursuing 2 targets through vertical urban terrain required logistical reorganization. It bought them 60 seconds. 60 seconds in which Superman turned his face toward the distant, filtered light of Coruscant's artificial upper atmosphere, absorbing what solar radiation he could through the layers above them, feeling his cells begin their slow climb back toward full capacity. 60 seconds in which Goku sat cross-legged on a Durasteel platform, closed his eyes, and let his Ki recalibrate against the galaxy's pervasive force presence, not fighting it anymore but finding the frequency where his own power and this alien energy could coexist without friction. When he opened his eyes, they were a shade brighter. The commander, he said, did you feel what was powering it? Superman nodded slowly. It was pulling from something, not generating it internally. Right. Goku looked down through the shaft they'd created, toward the distant sublevels, toward what lay beneath them in the bedrock. It's connected to whatever is down there. They all are. He paused, which means the Legion isn't just an army. Superman finished the thought. It's one organism. Cut the source, you cut them all. Above them, Coruscant's towers climbed toward a sky full of star destroyers. Below them, in caverns that official maps refused to acknowledge, the Phantom Legion stirred. They went down instead of up. It was, by any conventional military logic, the wrong decision. The Phantom Legion's vanguard was regrouping below them, the source of the dark side conduit that powered the Legion's hive coordination was somewhere in the bedrock, caverns beneath Coruscant's foundation layers, which meant descending was the equivalent of walking deliberately into the center of the problem rather than away from it. Sarah reached through a comm frequency she'd passed to them. In the safe house, spent approximately 15 seconds arguing against it before the signal cut to static. Goku and Superman went down anyway. The reasoning was straightforward, in the way that the most consequential decisions often are when stripped of everything except their essential logic. The Phantom Legion drew its coordination, its conditioning, its hive coherence from the dark side conduit at its source. The Vanguard commander had confirmed this inadvertently by the way it had rebuilt its energy discharge after the first attempt, not generating new power but redistributing what it drew from below. 40 soldiers with a severed power source were 40 very well-trained individuals. 40 soldiers connected to a Sith alchemized conduit were something closer to a single weapon with 40 points of contact. Remove the conduit. Change the equation. Superman had identified the thermal signature of the cavern complex during their brief ascent, his vision cutting through Coruscant's geological layers with the methodical patience of someone accustomed to searching for things that didn't want to be found. The caverns ran deep, carved in a rough spiral configuration that suggested deliberate design rather than natural formation, and at their lowest point his thermal imaging had found something that registered not as heat but as its absence, a cold so profound and so localized that it read as a wound in the planet's thermal fabric. The conduit had to be. They found a maintenance shaft that dropped below the safehouse levels and followed it down through 400 meters of increasingly ancient infrastructure, the layers of Coruscant's construction. History laid bare in cross-section, each stratum representing centuries of building over building over building until the original planetary surface was so far below the city's skin that it had become almost mythological. The air grew heavier as they descended, thicker. The force presence that Goku had been calibrating himself against since arrival intensified here. But it was wrong. The same energy, recognizable in the way a river is recognizable even when its water has been poisoned. Dark and pressurized and purposeful, they emerged into the caverns, through a collapsed section of ancient foundation wall, and stopped. The scale of it was the first thing. Even Superman, who had seen things that redefined the boundaries of scale, took a moment. The cavern was vast enough to generate its own microclimate, a faint artificial wind, circulating through the space, carrying the cold that his thermal vision had detected from above. Formations of the phantom legions stood in disciplined rows that stretched further than comfortable visibility. Thousands of dark-armored soldiers in a silence so complete it had texture. Between the formations, at intervals too regular to be coincidental, stood the conduit pillars, carved from Coruscant's bedrock and inscribed with Sith alchemy sigils that pulsed with that crawling dark energy in slow, rhythmic intervals, like a heartbeat, like breathing. At the cavern's center, elevated on a natural rock formation that the construction had deliberately preserved and incorporated, stood the conduit's core, a structure roughly 4 meters tall, built around what appeared to be a kyber crystal of extraordinary size, its natural clarity corrupted to absolute black by whatever ritual process had been performed on it over however many years this project had been running. The dark energy that radiated from it was visible to the naked eye, slow, crawling waves of corrupted force energy moving outward through the cavern in concentric rings, washing over the legions, formations with each pulse and returning something to the crystal, a feedback loop of conditioning and control that had presumably been running long enough to make the connection between the legion and they conduit as fundamental as breathing. How many? Goku said quietly. Thousands, Superman replied, equally quiet. Maybe more further back. The cavern continues beyond my visual range. And if we destroy the crystal? Superman was quiet for a moment, running calculations. The conduit collapses. The hive coordination breaks. They revert to individual soldiers. He paused. It won't make them passive. They're still conditioned, still trained. But without the collective coordination, they're a different problem, a manageable one. Then that's the target. It would have been simple, if not for what happened next. The nearest formation turned. In unison, every soldier in the caverns, visible range pivoting to face them with the single smooth movement of one organism operating through shared directive. No alarm had sounded. No signal had been visible. The conduit had felt them. The two blazing non-force signatures that had been burning in Palpatine's awareness since they'd fallen through the rift and communicated their presence to the Legion the way a nervous system communicates pain. The commander dropped from the cavern ceiling. It had followed them down through routes they hadn't taken, moving through Coruscant's infrastructure with a knowledge of its geography that confirmed it had been stationed here long, enough to memorize every path. It landed between them and they conduit with the settled weight of something that had been anticipating this moment. The Emperor is pleased, it said. You have saved considerable time. The dark energy between its hands was larger than before, fully rebuilt, drawing directly from the conduit at full strength now that they were inside the caverns. Influence radius. Goku felt it pressing against his Ki. The way the dimensional crossing had pressed against it, alien and seeking, looking for frequency overlap it could exploit. He powered up. Not to fall. Not yet. A deliberate, graduated increase, Super Saiyan Blue Ki rising through him in measured stages. The golden to blue. Transition casting the cavern in cold. Brilliant light that threw the Sith sigils on the conduit pillars into sharp relief, and made the nearest Legion soldiers raise gauntleted arms against the glare. He watched the commander recalibrate, watched the conduit pulse, faster in response to the energy, being introduced into its feedback loop, and filed away what he observed. The conduit could absorb energy directed at it. That's what the commander's weapons had been designed around, the ability to take Force energy used against the Legion and redirect it into the conduit, feeding the system rather than damaging it. Against Jedi, that design would be catastrophic. Every Force push, every lightning strike, every telekinetic assault would strengthen the thing they were trying to destroy. But Ki wasn't the Force, and solar energy wasn't either. Superman had reached the same conclusion from the other direction. He could see it in the way the commander was positioning itself, angled to intercept force-based assault vectors that they weren't planning to use. He caught Goku's eye and tilted, his head toward the conduit in the fractional communication they developed across an afternoon of fighting side by side. Goku gave the smallest possible nod. The commander launched its dark energy discharge, enormous now, a wave rather than a bolt, designed to fill the space between them and overwhelm through volume rather than precision. And both of them moved. Not away from it. Through it. Superman took the wave head-on, arms crossed before him. The corrupted force energy breaking across his Kryptonian physiology in cascading sheets of cold dark light. It hurt. Genuinely, significantly hurt. The deep cellular cold driving. Through his partially restored solar reserves with focused cruelty. He pushed forward through it one step at a time. Each step costing him something real. The commander's eyes widening. Fractionally as its most powerful attack failed to arrest 200 pounds of Kryptonian. Moving with absolute deliberate intent, Goku went over. Straight up and over the discharge wave. Ki flaring, moving at a speed that the cavern's scale made look almost leisurely. But that covered the distance between himself and they conduit in under a second. The Legion moved to intercept thousands of soldiers, hive-coordinated, converging with terrifying efficiency. He let them come, weaved through the first wave without striking back, not because he couldn't but because he was still reading, still understanding exactly how the coordination worked, how the individual soldiers adjusted based on collective information, where the response delays were in the system. There, a quarter second, lag between conduit pulse and soldier response adjustment. Not a flaw in the soldiers, a physical limitation of the feedback loop's transmission speed. A quarter second was an eternity. The commander redirected, abandoning Superman and turning its full attention to Goku's approach. Dark energy rebuilding for a concentrated strike at the one target it could not afford to let reach the conduit. Superman hit it from behind. Not with energy, not with heat vision or any ranged application of power. With his hands wrapped around the commander's robed shoulders, the raw physical strength of a Kryptonian, body moving at full available capacity, and for one moment, as the commander was arrested mid-redirect and slammed into the cavern floor with enough force to fracture the ancient bedrock. Superman felt something almost like satisfaction at the reminder that sometimes the oldest solutions were still the best ones. The conduit pulsed desperately, flooding the cavern with dark energy in a surge that staggered the nearest Legion formations and drove the soldiers furthest from its influence, briefly to their knees. Goku was already there. He placed both hands against the corrupted Kyber crystal's housing. Not a Kamehameha, not a Ki blast, not any projected energy technique. Direct contact. Ki flowing from his palms in a sustained, controlled stream that wasn't attacking the crystal, but simply existing alongside it. An alien energy that the conduit's absorption design had not been calibrated for, that the Sith alchemy couldn't process or redirect because it operated on principles the dark side had never encountered and built no defenses against. The crystal cracked. A hairline fracture, running from base to apex in a single clean line. The cavern went very quiet. In the formations around them, thousands of Phantom Legion soldiers stopped moving simultaneously, not dropping, not collapsing, but pausing. The hive coordination. Signals stuttering as the conduits. Feedback loop destabilized. Individual awareness returning to individual soldiers. Like light coming back to a room after a power fluctuation. Confusion replacing coordination. The collective becoming, once again, a collection. The commander on the cavern floor raised its head. Dark energy guttering around its hands like a dying flame. "You don't understand," it said. And for the first time its resonant voice carried something that might have been its own emotion rather than the conduit's directive. What holds without it? Before either of them could process that, the cavern shook. Not from below. From above. Deep, resonant impacts traveling through Coruscant's foundation layers from the surface, the unmistakable geological signature of weapons fire. Heavy weapons. Orbital grade. Superman was at full telescopic vision instantly, cutting through rock and infrastructure toward the surface. His expression told Goku everything before the words did. "The Star Destroyers," he said. "They're firing on the lower city." The Star Destroyers were not firing randomly. Superman understood this in the 3 seconds. It took him to process what his vision was showing him. The turbolaser strikes were precise, methodical, walking a perimeter around the sublevels, in a pattern that had nothing to do with suppression, and everything to do with containment. Palpatine wasn't destroying the lower city. He was sealing it, collapsing the maintenance shafts, the ventilation corridors, the ancient access tunnels that connected the underworld to the levels above. Every exit route from the cavern, complex being systematically eliminated from orbit, with the cold surgical efficiency of a man who had spent 60 years learning that the most effective traps were the ones the prey didn't recognize until the last wall closed. He had let them find the cavern. He had let them reach the conduit. He had watched, through the Force, through the commander, through the conduit's own awareness, watched them work out the solution and implement it and crack the crystal, and he had allowed all of it, because a cracked conduit served his purpose better than an intact one. The feedback loop's collapse hadn't weakened the Legion. It had released it. 10,000 soldiers, no longer requiring the conduit's coordination signal because they conditioning had always been the point. The conduit merely the training wheels, the external structure that had held the hive mind in place while the deeper Sith alchemy finished its work in each individual soldier's nervous system. The commander had tried to tell them, "You don't understand what holds without it." Goku felt the shift before Superman finished explaining it. The Legion soldiers around them were moving again, not with the eerie unison of conduit coordination but with something arguably more dangerous. Individual initiative, operating within Sith-conditioned parameters. Each soldier making its own tactical decisions, adapting in real time. No longer dependent on a centralized signal that could be disrupted. 10,000 experienced soldiers with dark side enhanced physiology acting on personal combat. Instinct rather than collective directive. The difference between a machine and the army. He powered up fully. Super Saiyan blue erupted through the cavern like a second sun being born underground. Azure Ki flooding the space. The Sith sigils on the conduit pillars shattering under the resonant pressure. The cracked Kyber crystal fracturing further as the energy washed over it. The nearest Legion formation staggered. Dark side conditioning reacting. To the godly Ki the way oil reacts to water. Violently and completely. Soldiers in the immediate radius were hurled backward by the pressure wave. Armor crumpling. Bodies skidding across ancient bedrock. It bought space, not time. Palpatine's orbital containment was already complete above them. The rumbling of collapsing infrastructure. Traveling through the rock in a constant geological percussion. But space. Superman was already in the air. Rising through the shaft they'd descended. Heat vision burning ahead of him to clear the path. His solar reserves had climbed through the engagement. Combat had a way of accelerating the process. his cells drinking in ambient energy with increased efficiency under stress. And he could feel the difference. Not full capacity. Close enough. He hit the first collapse section at speed and went through it. Duracrete and twisted durasteel parted around him like water. The debris field behind him creating a widening passage through what the turbolasers had sealed. He punched upward through 4 collapsed levels in 10 seconds, clearing a shaft wide enough for 2. The work costing him solar reserves he was simultaneously rebuilding. From the trace radiation filtering through Coruscant's atmospheric processes. Below him, Goku was managing the Legion. Not fighting them, managing them, which was a more complex and more demanding task. 10,000 individually motivated soldiers in an enclosed space required a different approach than 10,000 coordinated ones. He moved through the cavern in a continuous circuit, Ki flaring in controlled bursts that disrupted formations before they could consolidate, never stopping long enough to become a fixed target. Using the cavern's geography, the conduit pillars, the elevated rock formation, the natural choke points, to channel the Legion's pursuit into patterns. He could predict and redirect. He was buying Superman the minutes he needed. He was also in the part of his mind that never fully stopped, observing even in the middle of a fight, watching the Legion soldiers with something that sat uncomfortably between tactical assessment and grief. Up close, moving between them at speed, he could see what the Sith alchemy had done beneath the armor and the conditioning, the involuntary tremors in soldiers whose individual awareness had returned with the conduit's collapse, the confusion in movements that were simultaneously carrying out Sith-conditioned combat directives and struggling against them. These weren't willing warriors. He had already decided, before Superman cleared the first collapsed level, that he wasn't going to kill them. It made everything harder. It also made it the only option worth considering. Superman broke through to open air 11 levels above the cavern, emerging into a mid-city district, where the turbolaser strikes had cleared the surrounding blocks of civilian traffic. Palpatine had been thorough enough to establish a perimeter before firing, which was the most unsettling evidence, yet of how completely he had anticipated and orchestrated every step of this. The sky above was imperial grey, 3-star destroyers holding their orbital positions like judges at a tribunal, their turbolaser batteries still tracking the containment perimeter with patient mechanical precision. He went up, not toward the star destroyers, not yet, toward the sun. Coruscant's star was distant. Its light filtered through layers of atmosphere and the artificial environmental systems that maintained the city planet's habitable conditions. But it was there, and it was yellow. And as Superman climbed through the upper atmosphere and the filtering layers thinned around him, he felt his cells respond with the desperate gratitude of someone surfacing after too long underwater. Solar energy flooded through his Kryptonian physiology in a sustained wave, reserves climbing from depleted toward capacity in a process that took seconds rather than hours at this altitude. Full power. He turned toward the nearest Star Destroyer and moved. He didn't destroy it. The crew of a Star Destroyer numbered in the tens of thousands: officers, technicians, pilots, maintenance personnel, people who had chosen their service for reasons that ran the full spectrum of human motivation and deserved no collective punishment for the orders their ship was carrying out. He went for the weapon systems specifically, using precision over force, heat vision, burning through the turbolaser battery housings on the ventral surface with surgical focus, disabling the firing mechanisms without breaching the hull, moving to the second battery before the first crew could respond, and then the third, and the fourth in a sequence so fast that the Star Destroyer's point defense systems were still acquiring their target when he was already working on the next bank. 40 seconds. 1 Star Destroyer's turbolaser batteries, reduced to very expensive decorative architecture. He moved to the second. Below, in the cavern, Goku felt the orbital impact stop. The change in the Legion's behavior was immediate, without the psychological pressure of the containment bombardment. without the certainty of a sealed perimeter. The Sith conditioning lost a crucial element of its operational context. It had been designed to function in concert with Palpatine's broader strategic architecture, each component reinforcing the others. Remove one pillar and the structure didn't collapse, but it shifted, stressed in ways the original design hadn't fully accounted for. He stopped moving, stood still in the center of the cavern, super Saiyang blue blazing, and let the nearest soldiers come to him. Not to fight, but to present them with a choice. No conduit, no orbital containment, no hive coordination. Just 10,000 individuals in a cavern, looking at something their conditioning had no category for. "You don't have to do this," he said. His voice carried in the cavern's acoustics, reaching further than a normal human voice would have. He wasn't certain how many of them could understand his words, through whatever translation effect the dimensional crossing had granted him. But he held the tone, direct, without anger, without threat. The voice of someone who was not afraid of them and did not hate them for what they'd been made to be. Whatever was done to you, that's not who you have to be from here. It was a long shot. It was also the only play worth making. The nearest soldiers stopped. Not all of them. The Sith conditioning in many ran too deep for a single appeal to reach past it. And those continued their advance, but they were a fraction now. Dozens rather than thousands. And Goku handled them with precise, non-lethal efficiency that he could manage now that the numbers were workable. Pressure point strikes adapted from human anatomy that he'd assessed. During the engagement, Ki bursts calibrated to stun rather than damage. He moved through the remaining combatants in under a minute, leaving a wake of unconscious but breathing soldiers behind him. The rest stood in the cavern's blue-lit silence and did not attack. The cracked kyber crystal, starved of the feedback loop's energy, went dark. Palpatine felt it the moment the conduit died completely. He was seated at his throne, eyes closed, the Force showing him the cavern through the remaining threads of Sith alchemy still connected to his legion, fewer now, the individual connections dimming, one by one as soldiers chose stillness over combat directives. He watched the two blazing non-Force signatures moving through his architecture and dismantling it with the calm competence of beings who had dismantled comparable things before, in other contexts, in other galaxies. And he performed the calculation that he had been running since the moment they fell through the rift above his city. Could they be controlled? The answer the Force returned was unambiguous, definitively, completely, without any qualifying condition that his considerable intelligence could construct around it. No. He moved to contingency. Superman returned through the shaft he'd cleared, descending to the cavern to find Goku standing in the middle of a sea of stationary soldiers and they conduit dark and silent. He took in the scene in one sweep and felt something in his chest that wasn't quite surprise. "How?" he said. "Gave them a choice," Goku said. "Most of them took it." He looked at the soldiers around them with an expression that carried the weight of what he'd seen up close. Someone's going to have to figure out how to help them. What was done, it doesn't just go away. No, Superman agreed. It doesn't. Above them, Coruscant hummed, with the activity of a city that didn't know what had just happened beneath its foundation layers. The Star Destroyers held their orbital positions, weapons disabled, their commanders composing reports that no official Imperial channel would acknowledge receiving. In the Imperial Palace, the Emperor made 3 decisions in rapid succession, filed the entire incident in a section of his long-term planning that dealt with variables too significant to eliminate and too unpredictable to use, and returned his attention to other matters. It was the most dangerous outcome Goku and Superman could have produced. They had won. Palpatine had simply updated his plans. Coruscant kept its secrets the way it always had, beneath layers of light and noise and the accumulated weight of civilization pressing down on everything that happened in its depths. The Phantom Legion soldiers were recovered over the following weeks by the rebel cell. Sarah commanded, quietly, carefully, moved through underworld networks to locations where the Sith conditioning could be assessed and, where possible, undone. It was slow work, imperfect work. Some would never fully return to themselves, but some would. Goku and Superman remained on Coruscant long enough to ensure the conduits. Remnants were destroyed completely. The corrupted Kyber crystal reduced to fragments that carried no residual dark energy, long enough to establish, through Sarah's network, that the Phantom Legion's existence was documented, and its evidence distributed, to enough hands that its suppression became logistically impossible. Long enough, then, to start asking questions about the rift that had brought them here, and whether it could be reopened. The galaxy they were leaving behind was not fixed. Palpatine still sat on his throne. The Empire still stretched across 1,000 systems. The rebellion still fought with insufficient resources against overwhelming odds. But in the bedrock beneath the Eternal City, in caverns that official maps still refused to acknowledge, something that had been built to guarantee, one man's absolute power sat dark and silent and broken. It was not everything. It was not nothing. In the spaces between stars, two warriors from impossible worlds began the long journey home, carrying with them the knowledge that some galaxies, like some fights, are never truly finished.